Picture this. You walk into the most sacred hall in Christendom. The air reeks of death and incense mixed into something unholy. Clergy shuffle nervously in their finest robes, while aristocrats whisper behind jeweled hands. At the center of it all, propped on a throne like some grotesque puppet, sits a corpse. Not just any corpse, a pope. His jaw hangs slack, his eye sockets stare into nothing, and his rotting flesh barely clings to papal vestments that once commanded the respect of kings. Welcome to January 897 CE, when the Catholic Church did something so bizarre, so utterly insane, that even medieval chroniclers struggled to believe it happened. They put a dead pope on trial. What if your worst enemy could be dragged before a court after death? What if hatred ran so deep that not even the grave could protect you from one final humiliation? In the winter of 897, that nightmare became reality for Pope Formosus, and the Catholic Church would never quite recover from the spectacle that followed. This is the story of the Cadaver Synod, when politics, revenge, and religious authority collided in the most macabre courtroom drama in human history. By the time we're done, you'll understand why this forgotten trial reveals everything wrong with power, then and now. But first, let me paint you a picture of 9th century Rome, because without understanding the chaos, you can't grasp the madness. The city of corpses. Rome in 897 wasn't the eternal city of your history textbooks. It was a cesspit of violence, ambition, and death. Imagine Game of Thrones, but with more plague and fewer dragons. 3 popes had died in just 5 months, not from old age, from politics. The papal throne had become a revolving door of corpses, each new occupant wondering if they'd survive their first mass. 2 rival factions tore the city apart like hungry wolves. In one corner, you had the Spartans, ambitious dukes from central Italy who saw the papacy as their personal stepping stone to imperial power. In the other corner, the old Roman aristocracy, desperate to keep these upstart foreigners from turning their sacred city into a provincial backwater. Pope Formosus had been caught in the middle. Here was a man who'd started as a bishop, been excommunicated, exiled, brought back, and eventually crowned as pope in 891. Think of him as the ultimate political survivor, until he wasn't. When Formosus died in 896, after 5 years on the papal throne, his enemies thought they were finally free. They were wrong. Because in medieval Rome, death was just the beginning of your political problems. And Stephen VI, the new pope backed by Spartan money and ambition, had a very long memory and an even longer list of grievances. How does hatred survive the grave? How does a mummified corpse become the focal point of political revenge that would shock even the bloodthirsty medieval world? The answer began with a shovel and a very disturbed man's vision of justice. The unholy resurrection. Stephen VI had a problem. Every day, Formosus remained buried with papal honors. His legacy lived on. Every bishop Formosus had ordained, every decision he'd made, every alliance he'd forged, it all stood as testament to his legitimate reign. For Stephen and his backers, this was intolerable. So Stephen made a decision that would echo through history as one of the most deranged acts of political revenge ever conceived. He would put Formosus on trial, not his memory, not his legacy, his actual body. The chronicler known as the Liber Pontificalis, our best source for papal history, records what happened next with the kind of horrified fascination reserved for natural disasters. By order of Stephen, they dug up Formosus's body, dressed it in papal vestments, and propped it on a throne. Picture the scene. Grave robbers working by torchlight, their shovels striking the wooden coffin with hollow thuds. The stench of 7-month-old decay hitting them like a physical blow. Formosus's body, partially mummified by the Roman climate, lifted from its resting place like some macabre marionette. But this was just the prelude. What came next defied every standard of human decency known to the medieval world. They dressed the corpse in full papal regalia, the white silk vestments, the golden mitre, the sacred pallium, all placed on rotting flesh and exposed bone. Then came the procession through Rome's narrow streets, with witnesses later claiming the smell was so overpowering that dogs fled and children fainted. Did you know that witnesses claimed Formosus's jaw fell clean off during the trial? And yet, his body still managed to answer questions via a deacon speaking on its behalf. Imagine defending a client who literally cannot keep his face together. The destination was the Lateran palace, seat of papal power, where Stephen had prepared the most surreal courtroom in legal history. Theater of the Damned. January 897. The papal audience hall transformed into something between a courtroom and a morgue. Picture the scene: Stephen VI, very much alive and radiating self-righteous fury, seated on his papal throne. Across from him, propped upright with wooden supports, sat his predecessor's corpse. Formosus's body had been arranged with care that bordered on the obsessive, his rotting hands positioned to grip the throne's armrests, his legs carefully positioned to prevent the body from sliding forward. Most chilling of all, his eye sockets had been stuffed with cloth. Not out of respect, but because witnesses couldn't bear the sight of those empty holes that seemed to stare accusingly at his prosecutors. The charges Stephen read were both serious and absurd. Perjury. How do you cross-examine a corpse about lying? Acceding to the papacy illegally, a charge that could apply to half the popes in history. Arranging illegal ordinations, which, if true, would invalidate the careers of dozens of bishops. But here's where the Cadaver Synod becomes a twisted mirror of our modern cancel culture. This wasn't really about Formosus's alleged crimes. This was about erasing everything he'd accomplished, delegitimizing everyone who'd supported him, and rewriting history to serve the winner's narrative. Sound familiar? The trial's format was pure theater. Stephen would shout questions at the corpse. Did you or did you not unlawfully seize the papal throne? Then he'd pause dramatically, as if waiting for an answer from those sewn-shut lips. When silence followed, shocking, I know, a trembling deacon would speak for the deceased, offering weak defenses that everyone knew were meaningless. But the most surreal moments came when Formosus's body simply couldn't maintain the charade. His head would loll to one side, forcing court officials to rush forward and prop it back up. His left arm fell off entirely during the second day, causing several witnesses to flee in terror. Later, chroniclers reported that Formosus's nose was cut off and thrown into the Tiber River, an early form of internet trolling but with real, bloody consequences. They wanted to humiliate him even in death, to strip away every shred of dignity that might inspire his followers. As the deacon spoke in his defense, you have to wonder, would the crowd have believed the silent corpse could actually protest? Or was everyone just participating in collective madness, afraid to be the first to point out that they were shouting at a rotting body? Guilty as charged. The verdict was never in doubt. Stephen had already decided Formosus's fate before the first shovel hit the ground. After 3 days of this grotesque theater, the papal court pronounced the corpse guilty on all charges. What followed was a systematic destruction of everything Formosus represented. They stripped the body of its papal vestments, revealing the gray-green flesh beneath. Then came the symbolic mutilation. 3 fingers were severed from Formosus's right hand, the same fingers used to give papal blessings. Those fingers, once raised to bless kings and consecrate churches, were tossed aside like garbage. But Stephen's revenge wasn't finished. In a final act of desecration, Formosus's remains were dragged through Rome's streets and dumped into the Tiber River. The message was clear. This man was so evil that even the earth rejected his presence. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Romans had witnessed many horrors, wars, plagues, political assassinations, but this crossed a line that even medieval sensibilities couldn't tolerate. Citizens rioted in the streets, demanding that Formosus be reburied with papal honors. Church bells rang in protest. Even hardened aristocrats who'd backed Stephen began questioning their allegiance to a man who would defile the dead. When the living feel more sympathy for a corpse than for their own leaders, you know the spectacle has gone too far. Imagine a sitting president today exhuming a predecessor to prove a point. Social media would explode overnight. The Cadaver Synod was medieval Twitter cancellation taken to its logical extreme, and the backlash was just as swift and devastating. Stephen had won his trial, but he'd lost something far more valuable: his legitimacy. The Roman people had seen their leader's true character, and they were horrified. Divine comedy becomes tragedy. What goes around comes around, sometimes with interest. Within months of the Cadaver Synod, Stephen VI found himself facing his own reckoning. A popular uprising, fueled by disgust over the corpse trial, stormed the Lateran palace. Stephen was stripped of his papal vestments, imprisoned, and eventually strangled to death in his cell. The next pope, Romanus, immediately overturned the Cadaver Synod's verdict. The chronicler Liutprand of Cremona praised Romanus's courage for righting this literal grave injustice. Fishermen were ordered to drag the Tiber until they recovered Formosus's waterlogged remains, which were then reburied with full papal honors. But the story wasn't over. Medieval politics were never that simple. Over the next decade, 3 more popes would overturn and then reinstate the Cadaver Synod's sentence, depending on which faction controlled Rome. Formosus was posthumously innocent, then guilty, then innocent again. A papal ping-pong ball bouncing between factions even in death. The chaos only ended when a more pragmatic pope declared the entire affair null and void, noting that the dead cannot defend themselves and God alone judges the departed. Apparently, it took the medieval church nearly 15 years to figure out that you can't put a corpse on trial. But here's the most chilling part. Despite the eventual reversal, the Cadaver Synod achieved exactly what Stephen intended. Every bishop Formosus had ordained lived under a cloud of suspicion. Every church he'd consecrated faced questions about its legitimacy. His supporters were marginalized or eliminated entirely. The trial of a corpse had successfully destroyed a man's legacy more thoroughly than any character assassination of the living could have managed. Why dead popes still matter. You might wonder why a 1,000-year-old papal scandal matters today. After all, we've moved beyond medieval barbarism, right? We don't literally dig up our enemies and put them on trial, or do we? Think about our modern obsession with canceling the dead. Confederate statues torn down in midnight raids, authors stripped from reading lists for 19th century views, historical figures judged by contemporary standards and found wanting. We may not prop up corpses in courtrooms, but we certainly put the deceased on trial in the court of public opinion. The Cadaver Synod was the ultimate expression of something very human and very ugly. The desire to win so completely that even death can't protect your enemies. Stephen VI wanted to erase Formosus not just from history, but from the very concept of legitimate papal succession. Melvin Bragg once called it the most grotesque moment in papal history, yet most of us never heard about it in grade school. We learn about the Crusades and the Inquisition, but somehow this story of institutional madness got buried deeper than Formosus himself. Why? Because the Cadaver Synod reveals something uncomfortable about power and human nature. It shows us what happens when ideology becomes so poisonous that basic human decency gets thrown out the window, when revenge matters more than justice, when winning matters more than sanity. The Catholic Church survived the Cadaver Synod, but it never quite recovered from the shame. Medieval chroniclers used the trial as a cautionary tale about political overreach and divine judgment. They understood what Stephen VI had forgotten. Some victories cost more than defeats. The corpse that wouldn't stay buried. If a corpse could be tried for political crimes, what does that say about us, our fears, our hunger for punishment, and our willingness to humiliate even the dead? The Cadaver Synod forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the lengths we'll go to destroy our enemies. Stephen VI thought he was conducting a trial, but he was really performing an exorcism, trying to cast out the ghost of his predecessor's legitimacy through pure spectacle. He failed, as all such efforts ultimately do. You can't kill ideas by mutilating the corpses of those who held them. You can't erase history by dragging dead popes through the streets. You can't achieve justice by abandoning every principle that makes justice meaningful. The real tragedy of the Cadaver Synod isn't that a corpse was put on trial, it's that living people participated in the charade, bishops who knew better, aristocrats who should have protested, citizens who watched in silence as their leaders descended into madness. The Cadaver Synod reminds us that sometimes the ugliest trials are not those of mortal men, but of memory, forgiveness, and the fate we leave behind. It's a story about what happens when we let hatred outlive its target, when we become so obsessed with winning that we forget what we're fighting for. In the end, both Stephen and Formosus are dust. Their political factions are forgotten footnotes. The issues that seemed so crucial in 897 CE matter to no one but historians. But the Cadaver Synod endures as a monument to human folly, a reminder that the dead deserve better than to become pawns in the games of the living. Drop a comment. Which moment shocked you most? The jaw falling off during testimony? The 3 severed blessing fingers? Or maybe the fact that this actually happened and somehow got left out of most history books? Would you dare to defend a corpse? Or would you join the jeering crowd, swept up in the madness of the moment? Think about it the next time you see someone trying to cancel the dead. If you want more forgotten scandals from history, the kind of stories that make you question everything you thought you knew about human nature, click subscribe and join the Wicked Past community. Because trust me, the Cadaver Synod is just the beginning of how dark and weird our ancestors could get. Next week, we're diving into medieval torture methods that make modern horror movies look like children's bedtime stories. You won't want to miss it, assuming you can sleep after learning about the Cadaver Synod.